Loud and Clear.
Welcome back to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. Venezuela has voted in elections for a constituent assembly with over 8 million people participating, despite violence and threats from the right-wing political opposition. What's next for the country's Bolivarian revolution? We are joined from Montreal by Arnold August. He is a lecturer, journalist, and author of the new book, Cuba, U.S. Relations, Obama, and Beyond. Welcome back, Arnold.
Thank you very much for having me once again.
Thank you for joining. A very decisive moment in Venezuela's process, the Bolivarian revolutionary process. Tell us what happened, and was this a victory for the Maduro government, the PSUV? It's been beleaguered by violent street protests. Much of the media here makes it sound like all of Venezuela actually opposes the government. But what's your read on this?
Well, my take on this is as follows. Firstly, several weeks ago, I was actually wondering, given all of the violence that has been organized by the United States and their agents within Venezuela, and covered widely by the international media as an additional pressure, I was actually wondering whether the government was actually able to hold this constituent assembly vote in anything resembling to a voting process, to a political process. Such was the violence and the provocations against the Bolivarian government. And so, as I was watching the news, probably as you were doing through Telesur yesterday, the whole day, right into late at night, it was very encouraging to see the millions of people. I mean, we knew later it was millions of people who actually defied, the entire international imperialist order, defied that. 8 million people at the base, at the grassroots, defied the imperial order and actually went to vote. So I think that constitutes a victory. Now, 8 million. It is said that 8 million people voted. I mean, that is a large number of people who are extremely conscious, politically conscious, ideologically conscious about the overall situation in Venezuela and the role of U.S. imperialism and their opposition forces in Venezuela. They are conscious about it. I think that, to answer your question, I would say it was a victory.
Okay, let me jump in here, Arnold. The turnout was, according to the government, 41.53% of the population, or 8,089,000 plus people. That's according to the Electoral Council president. The opposition has said that they believe the actual number to be about half of that, or perhaps lower. But let's help the audience understand, because we're getting all of our news here filtered through the mainstream media. How transparent is Venezuela's voting process? How does this contrast, this vote, with the poorly run opposition so-called plebiscite that was held a couple of weeks ago? Real quick, talk about how Venezuela's electoral system works. Is it transparent? Because, of course, Donald Trump is just saying we're going to impose economic sanctions, more sanctions against Venezuela for the dictatorship, and he had threatened to do so if they went forward with the referendum on the Constituent Assembly. Is it transparent?
Yeah, well, another U.S. president, namely Jimmy Carter, in the course of doing an on-the-spot investigation, as you know, he's involved in verifying different electoral and political processes around the world, he stated in his official report that the Venezuelan political electoral system is the most transparent in the world. Now, this is coming from someone who is a president of the United States. It's not coming from anyone on the left or whatever. So I think this is a good measure. And many people, including myself, who have witnessed it indicates very clearly that it is open. And I think another very important proof that highlighted highlights that it is, in fact, transparent is that when the Bolivarian Revolution lost the elections in the last legislative elections a year ago, they admitted it immediately. And so if it was not transparent, if it was rigged, of course they would have tried to rig it so that they won the elections. But
yeah, that's true. That's an interesting point. The PSUV, the Popular Socialist Unity Government Party, they lost the last election, and they lost by a considerable number in the parliamentary majority, their previous parliamentary majority, and they've won election after election after election. The opposition always says those elections are rigged, but when the opposition won the election a year ago, the government said, yes, it was a free and fair election and we lost, and then the Venezuelan opposition, which then became in charge of the parliament, they have resorted to really what amounts to basically economic warfare and very, very violent protests against the government. Now, let's help the audience understand a couple things, and we have to go quick because we have a limited amount of time. The Constituent Assembly is for what purpose? In other words, it's to rewrite the Constitution. It's part of a democracy. I mean, in other words, if somebody looks up Constituent Assembly, if they Google it, for instance, or they do use some other search engine, they'll come up. It's a very important part of different countries' democratic functions. It's a way for the population to be involved in writing the Constitution. Talk about what the Constituent Assembly is and why this is so opposed by the right wing and so important to the government.
Yes, just an introductory anecdote to what you said. If people Google Constituent Assembly and how it operates, they will not find the Constituent Assembly of one country, and that is the United States of America. Because the United States of America's so-called Constituent Assembly was organized by a few slave owners of several centuries with no input at all from the people. So I think the last country in the world to give lessons to Venezuela or any other country with regards to Constituent Assembly is completely off base.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick, Arnold August, because I want to let the audience know that you are totally right. The first act of the U.S. Constitutional Convention that was held 230 years ago in 1787 was to make sure that there would be absolute secrecy. It was called the secrecy provision. So this small number of very, very rich, mostly slave owners, not exclusively guys, got together, and they, in secret, developed a constitution that prevented women from voting, that determined that the enslaved African population in the South would be 3/5 of a human being for representation purposes. So you are totally right. The U.S. doesn't have a Constituent Assembly. Our Constitution, which is so discussed all the time, was developed in secret 230 years ago. Go ahead.
Yes. And so getting back to, can you just remind me what your main question is? I'm sorry.
I was asking about why this is important to the government, why this Constituent Assembly, why this is an important step in Venezuela's political process, and why the right-wing opposition so opposes a Constituent Assembly.
Okay. The Constituent Assembly is crucial in the current political process of Venezuela. The opposition won the Legislative Assembly over a year ago, but instead of using their legal right to adopt laws, propose laws, work with the other sections of the government, such as the presidency, etc., to improve the situation in Venezuela and stop the economic war, etc., they actually used their majority for their own sectarian political view, which was to undermine the Bolivarian Revolution, including the duly elected president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And thus, they used that election and the control of the Legislative Assembly as the groundwork for undermining the revolution, thus making Venezuela objectively ungovernable. And thus, they link this to the violent activities all across the country, including burning people and killing people because they are thought to have been Chavistas or because they are black. Now, the situation became ungovernable, and thus the Constitution, the Bolivarian Constitution, had the foresight to have provisions that if the situation becomes difficult, legally the Constitution allows for the government to organize a constituent assembly, a new constituent assembly, but not to organize another constitution, but to rather amend the existing constitution, which was adopted back in 1999, so that the Venezuelan could go forward, in this case, to develop its economic and social problems, despite all the roadblocks that are being put in their path by the United States and their allies in Venezuela. So it is crucial, not more. Crucial is actually an understatement. It's a question of life and death struggle for the Bolivarian Revolution and the actual future of Venezuela as a country, that there is a need for this new political platform to go forward in the case of this current impasse and try to stop or undermine the violence that is taking place in Venezuela now. Now, they will be meeting within 72 hours. Those who have been elected last night, and of course more elections are taking place tomorrow, when the indigenous seats are being voted upon in outlying areas in the country. Once this is done, the Constituent Assembly, the new one, will be meeting in several days. Now, their main task will be to work out amendments to the Constitution. And this, I think, the step after that is very important, that it is expected to be presented to the people on December 19th of this year. December 19th of this year. That's right. This referendum is to be held December 19th of this year.
So, in other words, the Constituent Assembly will come together. They'll amend the Constitution, which is part of many countries' democratic processes. They don't replace the existing parliamentary grouping, which is at the moment headed by the political opposition, a political opposition which has tried to use their position in Parliament to overthrow the democratically elected government, President Maduro. Similarly, I would say, to what happened in Brazil with the legislative coup against Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party. But, okay, now we have a new situation, Arnold August, and that's who we're speaking to, Arnold August from Montreal, about yesterday's Constituent Assembly elections in Venezuela. The opposition says the government is inflating how many people participated. The government says no. 41% of the population participated, more than 8 million people. We obviously have polarization, Arnold, in Venezuela. There is a class struggle. There is a political struggle going on. Donald Trump has announced that there will be a new round of sanctions intended to make good on his earlier threat, quote, to have strong and swift economic actions if Maduro went ahead with Sunday's election. There's a debate about what exactly those economic sanctions will be. Of course, Venezuela's economy is an oil economy first and foremost. I want to play a short clip, Arnold, from President Maduro, who is speaking to RT about earlier U.S. sanctions. This was from a couple of weeks ago. And I want to ask you about what we might expect now from the United States and why the United States is getting involved in Venezuela's elections. Let's listen to Nicolas Maduro.
Venezuela is ready for any scenario. I think it's insane for the extreme right in the US to be talking of a blockade against Venezuela. In fact, they've already started an indirect blockade against our financial system. This was the cause of the crisis over the past 3 years. But we have economic strength, and Venezuela always pays what it owes and fulfills its responsibilities. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, our country will continue to fulfill them.
Arnold August, Maduro defiantly saying to Donald Trump and to the U.S. government, okay, we've lived up to our end of business bargains who are having economic sanctions imposed on us. Economic sanctions are, again, a tool of the powerful against the less powerful because, for instance, nobody can sanction the United States if it does something illegal or if people don't like its electoral processes, etc. But talk about what the new sanctions might be. And again, we have a limited amount of time, so kind of go over it quickly for our audience, if you would.
Well, I think the new sanctions may be related to actually sanctioning and making it difficult for members of the Maduro government to operate legally, to have them persona non grata in other countries such as the United States, which where the United Nations is being housed. And specifically, I think it'll be moving towards the oil reserves and the oil production of Venezuela, because we have to keep in mind, Brian, that the bottom line of all this is that the United States wants to control or get back the massive oil reserves that are sitting on the shores and under the shores of Venezuela. I think everything will be directed to that, and also to make the economy even more somewhat chaotic. We cannot say that it is not chaotic, make it more chaotic, and increase the violent activities by the opposition groups in Venezuela to create a situation of civil war, or something that looks to civil war, whereby the United States and other powers, including, shamefully, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, can support an American military invasion in Venezuela under the pretext of humanitarian need.
Arnold, let me ask you, we have about 2 minutes left. Do you think there is any circumstances under which the United States could actually openly, with its own military forces, intervene in Venezuela? I mean, wouldn't Latin America, under the like a Yankee invasion of Venezuela, wouldn't that lead to like just a continent-wide uprising?
Yes, it can lead to it can have a boomerang effect. It can backfire. But at the same time, if we have to be quite honest in looking at the statements in the last few days, whereby important countries such as Mexico, Colombia, Panama have actually supported indirectly intervention in order to try to bring Venezuela to a so-called peaceful situation. So I don't think that it is out of the question. I think it is possible. Of course, they might do it indirectly by fully supporting even more their ground troops, their current ground troops, which consist of these young thugs, arming them even further. We see in the video that these guys are pretty well armed. They have arms. They have defensive equipment. The United States can step up these armed groups so that they will in fact act as U.S. military, but not with the American uniform. They will be doing it under the uniform of being a peaceful opposition or pro-democracy demonstrator, but it will amount to the same thing as a direct U.S. military intervention, which is always impossible. One thing for sure, if the United States does send troops into Venezuela, even if it is in a relatively small scale, even those countries such as Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, who take a very strong line against the Maduro government, they might have to draw the line there in order to save their Latin American dignity and oppose any attempt to introduce U.S. troops into Venezuela.
I think it's a risky proposition, but of course, as you've said, the United States can use sort of contras. In other words, armed groups from within. The U.S. did that in Nicaragua. Reagan funded the Civil War. They're using the ex-National Guard right-wing dictatorship troops to carry out a war against the Sandinistas. They used forces inside of Chile to overthrow the democratically elected socialist government of Allende. They did it in 1954 in the coup d'etat against Guatemala, against the Arbenz government. And, of course, there was the Bay of Pigs, where the U.S. invaded Cuba but using proxy forces. Anyway,
that's a very good point, Brian. I'm glad that you raised it. It gives us a perspective of how the United States can operate in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, we'll have to stay on top of that. We're out of time, completely out of time. We've been joined from Montreal by Arnold August. He is a lecturer, journalist, and the author of the new book, Cuba, U.S. Relations, Obama, and Beyond. You're listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear.